What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review of Jade Empire. Now, I personally had never played Jade Empire prior to this. However, the game originally released as an Xbox exclusive all the way back in 2005. It did later receive a PC port back in 2007, and I believe you can even play it on mobile devices these days as of 2016. But overall, Jade Empire is a title that I had always heard great things about. It is, of course, from Bioware back in their heyday, and as such, I just finally got around to reviewing it. Now, it being an older title, this is a game you can pick up for very cheap on Steam or GOG, and while I cannot speak for the GOG release, the Steam release has a lot of problems. Because if you pick this up on Steam, your first boss fight is going to be getting the game to run. Because from what I've read, and what I experienced personally, the vast majority of people cannot even start the game if they just buy it and try to run it on Steam. You actually have to, thanks to some handy Steam guides who had already figured this stuff out for me, go in and change a couple of files. In one case, just add a blank file actually, which will then cause the game to actually work. However, if you then want the game to run well, you have to alter a couple other files so your frame rate isn't like 10. That said, outside of technical issues, I actually did have a lot of fun with this game, so with no further ado, let's jump into it a little bit. Now, the story set up for Jade Empire, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, by the way, in case you happen to decide to play this title, but the story setup is that we play the last spirit monk, and we start the game out training in a school for martial arts experts, or at least martial arts experts in training. However, that village is shortly thereafter attacked, and then through these events, our character finds out that they are the last spirit monk, and that the rest of your people were wiped out in an attack on a city by the Emperor, which resulted in the disappearance of a very prominent god, which has since led to the spirits of the dead refusing to move on to the afterlife, all of which has apparently been caused by the Emperor, and shortly after we learn all of this, our little village gets attacked again, and the game gets kicked off properly as we start hunting down our lost master who was kidnapped in the latest attack, and then the plot evolves from there. Now, my thoughts on the story were that it was overall very good. It had some really good moments, and while I would say if you're familiar with BioWare's writing around this time, none of the big twists are probably going to surprise you very much. However, nonetheless, I do think they were pretty well written. I think the story overall was really cool concept. It does have multiple endings, however, you do choose most of those right at the end. I believe there's 3, and despite choosing those pretty much at the end, you do have a lot of choices throughout the game. And those choices will give you the karma system, basically, that we saw in BioWare's KOTOR title, as this game runs off the same engine, so you see a lot of those systems reused. And in this particular one, our light side, if you will, is the way of the open palm, and the evil guy is the way of the closed fist. Now, depending on which one of these you're leaning towards, it will slightly affect what equipment you can use, and some of the quests you are capable of completing. But from there, let's talk character creation a little bit. So at the beginning of the game, we're going to pick a pre-generated character. You can alter them a little bit, but you can't change their appearance or anything. You're kind of stuck with the characters available, and they all kind of come with a preset of abilities for you. However, you can customize their abilities. And if you choose to customize, you'll basically put points into either body, mind, or focus. This is your health, your mana, and like your stamina. Now, the other thing that raising these attributes does actually also raises a corresponding persuasion ability, which is intimidate, charm, or intuition. And beyond that, there are no skills. So from there, you pick your starting styles if you're customizing, which is your combat styles, if you will, how you're approaching combat. And then you get started with a short tutorial, run through the first part of the game, which we've already discussed, and then let's talk world building a little bit. The game itself is very linear. It's a pretty short game. It's probably going to run you in the ballpark of maybe 15 hours or so. And in that 15 hours, there are 2 main hubs that you're going to be completing a lot of quests from. And this is where the game actually does a good job with what it's working with, because inside those 2 hubs, there's a ton of side quests and things that you can take part in. Almost all of them have different outcomes depending on how you approach them. And despite the relatively limited systems within the game's framework, you are nonetheless making a lot of decisions, some of which will change whether or not you have to fight or not, the outcome of the quest. So it feels like your decisions are having impact on the world. And then from there, a lot of these quests actually explore concepts that are brought up as you play the game, because in this particular game, while it is kind of rooted in almost a cheesy kung fu movie style, there is nonetheless a lot of Chinese culture and folklore kind of played around with here in the game. And a lot of the quests explore those concepts, all of the different mythological creatures that are kind of hanging around, all of the magic and stuff, and how those things work in the world. And despite the relatively short runtime, they just fit a lot of that stuff in there, and it was really fun to explore those things and just played through so many quests that had a ton of different options. And I think the world building is really best described as a sort of mystical, cheesy kung fu movie, and I enjoyed it a lot. In order to move from place to place and hub to hub, if you will, you have to get yourself a hold of a flyer as part of the game. And if you want to, you can engage in this mini game where you fly this sort of mechanical contraption that can fire guns and things. So there's even a layer, if you will, of steampunk meets magic technology going on, which is kind of in the background. So they really did layer a lot of stuff for you to check out and see. But again, the game is ultimately pretty linear and pretty short, so there's really only so much they could cram in there. And while you're doing that adventuring, you're going to be picking up companions. There are a good few, but overall they had pretty interesting stories, but they don't really have any quests associated with them outside of some main story stuff, so you do have to make a point to go back to your little camp area and talk to them in order to get those stories. And while the companions themselves are pretty interesting and I like their characters, you really kind of have to go out of your way to get any sort of interaction with them at all. And some of that interaction can include up to 3 romances. So if you are engaging with Dawnstar, Silk Fox, or Sky pretty regularly, you can potentially romance them. But honestly, the romance is not bad. Like the dialogue and stuff is pretty good, but it just doesn't add much to the game, really. But nonetheless, it's there for the people who enjoy that kind of thing. And from there, let's talk combat, because that's the most interesting part, right? So this game is an action combat system, which sees you weaving and playing around with combat styles. And these are your various martial arts disciplines, your various weapon disciplines, including some magic things you can get your hand on. And honestly, there's a ton of these. You're going to be learning a lot. You will fight demons occasionally, and you'll learn their form from them. And this will actually let you turn into that demon. And then late game, you can even get your hands on a gun, a musket specifically, so it's a little slow to fire. But I thought it was hilarious that they just decided to throw a gun into this game as one of your combat styles. But to get the most out of combat, you need to understand the blocking system, the dodging system, and weaving your styles together, because you can get harmonies, as they call them, when you switch between various types of disciplines, if you will. That is to say, martial arts styles or magic styles or weapon styles. And if you kind of mix and match those, you can get a really good combo going. And then you combine everything you can do there, which includes various play styles, with the fact that you can have one of your companions with you at any given time who have their own specialties, and you've got a pretty robust combat system, especially for the short runtime that it's available. Because some of the disciplines available to you are things like magical attacks, so you can build a sort of mage if you want to. You can focus on more weapon-oriented disciplines. Some monsters and enemies are immune to certain disciplines, so you have to mix and match them. And as you level up, you can level up your styles as well, which includes things like reducing their cost, increasing their damage, etc. And all things considered, the combat is surprisingly robust, and you can tell they probably put a lot of emphasis on this in development, because even to this day, while it is definitely a little stiff and clunky in parts due to its age, it nonetheless holds up pretty well. But let's talk positives and negatives and wrap this thing up. So positives, the world that they've built here is really cool. Again, they explore some really cool concepts. They did a lot with a little in that regard. The combat is surprisingly fun, even 17 years later. And honestly, the game is pretty well written, all things considered. I liked a lot of the characters. In fact, my really only complaint when it comes to the story is that some of the bad guys do that stereotypical thing that you actually see in Star Wars, funny enough, where they're so evil to the point that they're just cannibalizing themselves. And it's like, honestly, the bad guy's worst enemy is themselves. It's ridiculous. That was really the only complaint I had story-wise. The rest of it was really well done. Now, in terms of negatives, huge technical issues. Again, if you buy this on Steam, you're going to have trouble just getting it to run, which for a game this old, and especially how minor the problems are, because honestly, if you know what the problem is and how to fix it, you can fix it yourself in the span of like 15 minutes. So it's ridiculous to me that 17 years on, Bioware, who is still selling this game for a profit, hasn't fixed this very minor issue with their distribution of this game. And then my other negative, honestly, is that there's just not enough of the game. I really would have loved to play around with it some more. Obviously, it's getting a bit older, and graphically, some of it doesn't work. Some of the systems are a bit older, and they don't work. So those are definitely going to be negatives for some people as well. However, if you're willing to overlook those things, my conclusion for this game is that it's a surprisingly good experience that holds up very well to this day, even if it does nonetheless have some problems. And in fact, in playing through this, I can see why people have talked about wanting a second Jade Empire, because just from playing through this, you can kind of see some areas for improvement. and expansion. For instance, adding more role-playing systems. The game itself is surprisingly light on role-playing systems, given how much choice and consequence they have here. So even if they expanded some of that stuff, they could have a really big hit on their hands if they released a second game. Or at least they could have, because we're certainly never getting one now, as I don't think it's really controversial to call Jade Empire a dead IP. But nonetheless, overall, great game. Gonna have some issues if you buy it and try to play it for yourself, honestly, but nonetheless, too bad it never got a sequel, because honestly, to this day, very enjoyable experience. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.